Good day everybody, RC Grabag here, welcome back to the channel. So in my last video I started making some hard shell scenery with aluminum window screen and plaster cloth, and then followed it up with making some rock castings using rubber rock molds and ultra-cal plaster. For a good part of this video we're going to be heading down into the workshop to spend some time building a number 8 turnout, and then it's back to the layout room to see how this and other hand-built control points perform. Also on the agenda, my good buddy and master modeler Karl stopped by earlier this week with another completed structure kit for the layout. He does amazing work and we'll be taking a closer look at his latest creation. Now in the early days when the garage addition and the layout itself was still in my head as mostly a someday plan, I decided that I was going to hand build all the turnouts for the someday layout. So before the garage and layout room additions were even started, I was already cranking out turnouts in anticipation. I had done a good amount of research back then and settled on the Fast Track system of fixtures, tools, and materials for building my turnouts. Fast Tracks has a complete set of product offerings to simplify turnout construction, as well as construction of other control point fixtures like crossovers, Ys, and slip switches. Now I'm going to start by building a number 8 turnout, and we'll go over some of the items used to do that. So the first thing we're looking at here is a number 8 turnout fixture, and as you can see you can make both a left and right hand turnout with it. This fixture will align the parts of the turnout as you're building it. I'm also going to be doing a good bit of filing of the rail to form the points, frogs, and stock rails. So for that I'm going to be using these helpers called a stockade and a point form. Both of these are designed to hold the rail a certain way so that when you file the rail, you'll get the proper shape every time. This is just a general purpose scriber and I'll use that for marking things as you'll see. We also have this ply bond glue, which is basically a contact cement, a red Sharpie for marking things in a different way, a precision jeweler's saw, also known as a coping saw, a regular file for shaping the rail, some smaller assorted files also for shaping the rail, particularly this flat one with the sharp edges that will be used to cut electrical gaps, as you'll see, a set of rail cutters, a stiff wire brush, and finally a good soldering iron. Now in addition to the tools I've mentioned, you're also going to need materials for the turnout itself. So here I have some Code 83 rail from Micro Engineering, and it comes in 18-inch and 36-inch lengths. Next we have these copper strips, and they will serve as both railroad ties and anchors that will hold the form of the turnout until I add the remaining wood ties. And finally, Fast Tracks offers these laser cut tie beds that make adding the remaining wood ties a breeze. So aside from the soldering iron and the Sharpie, all of the tools and materials I mentioned here are available directly from Fast Tracks. Okay, so we have our tools and materials ready, so let's get to building. So for the first step in the actual build that I'm going to do is to cut the copper PCB ties to the proper length. And for that, I'm first marking the length on the tie with the scribe tool, and then just using an old pair of rail nippers to cut the tie where I marked it. Once the tie is cut, I'll square up and smooth the cut end with a file. And then I'll just repeat the process. Now when you get to this part of the fixture, you have a choice to be made to go with either hinged rail points or solid points as noted by the H and S engravings. I personally like the solid points as opposed to the hinges, so my next tie is going to go into the slot marked with the S. And now I'm just sizing, cutting, and filing the remaining ties. And the last tie I'm putting in place here is the throw bar tie. With the copper ties in place, we're going to want to cut some electrical gaps in the ties so that current can't pass from the rail on one side of the turnout to the other. And for that, I'm going to use this file that has a very thin edge. Here I am simply using the file to cut through just the top copper layer to create the gap. For the throw bar tie, I'm going to mark 2 gap cuts spaced about 1/4 of an inch apart, and we'll see why later on. The next 2 ties will just make a single gap in the center of each one of them. Now when I get to this cluster of ties around the frog, I'll need to cut additional gaps because each tie is spanning 4 rails. And I'm just pointing the gaps out with the scribe here because they're a little hard to see on camera. In addition to these gaps, later on I'll be cutting gaps in the rails with the coping saw to further isolate the frog. And now, let's take a break from the turnout build and have a look at my friend Karl's latest contribution to the layout. This is the Fine Scale Miniatures Emporium Seafood. It's a wood kit roughly 21 by 12 inches. This building will eventually occupy one of the waterfront areas of my layout. Hope you enjoyed this little break taking a look at Karl's fine work. We'll have another break coming up as I just received a surprise package containing a locomotive that I had ordered sometime last year and it finally arrived. And now let's get back to the turnout build. For the next steps I'll be working on the rail for the turnout. But before I do, let's look at a diagram of a turnout so that we can see the various rail pieces that need to be cut and formed. The first rails I'm going to be working on are the outermost rails, otherwise known as the stock rails. Then I'll move on to the set of inner rails, also known as the closure rails. And as you'll see, the closure rails consist of one piece of rail that will include both the frog wings at one end, to the right, highlighted in red, and because I chose solid points earlier on, the closure rails will also include the switch point rails at the other end, highlighted in blue. And then lastly, I'll be doing the frog rails followed by the guard rails. When starting work on the rails, the first thing I'll do is size up the length of the stock rails, and it's a good idea when doing this to have one of the quick sticks tie beds handy. And here I have a set of quick sticks for a number 8 turnout, and you'll see that the aluminum turnout fixtures dimensions don't quite match up to the quick sticks. So I just need to make sure that when sizing up the stock rails that enough rail extends on either end of the tie bed to accommodate rail joiners for my completed turnout, with a little extra for a margin of error. The next thing I want to do with the stock rails is to file part of the base to provide a recess for the point rails. This recess will allow the tips of the point rails to rest flush against the stock rails to ensure that my locomotives and rolling stock can make a smooth transition from the stock rails to the point rails and vice versa. So I'm using these recesses in the fixture to tell me where to make a mark on the base of the stock rail, and then I'm marking the base with my red Sharpie. Now I'm going to use my stockade tool to file out the recess in the stock rail. So I'll slide the rail into the stockade at one end, and looking for the red mark I made earlier, I'll align the mark to the edge of the stockade filing area as you see here. Then I want to tighten down these bolts at either end of the stockade to ensure that the rail is held in securely. The next step is to file the rail, and I'm filing pretty aggressively at the end of the rail where my red mark is because that's where the point will rest when the turnout is thrown in that direction. So I want to file the rail flush with the stockade at that end. And then as I'm working the file in the direction away from my red mark, I'll work in sort of a curve into the base of the rail, filing less aggressively the further away I get from the red mark. Notice how the rail base is filed flush to the right and tapers a bit as you look to the left. And with the rail out of the stockade, the recess filed into the base is pretty apparent. The rail tends to bend a bit from the pressure of filing, so just bend it back as needed. Incidentally, aside from the filing method shown here for illustration purposes, I typically want to avoid getting the metal filings on my hands, so I'll glove up the hand holding the stockade and file over a trash can to catch the tiny metal particles. So with the first stock rail sized and filed, I'll do the same to the second stock rail. The second stock rail is the curved stock rail, so we'll need a couple of additional steps after filing. If you recall from the turnout diagram, you'll notice the curved stock rail makes an abrupt bend just as it reaches the tip of the adjacent point. So I'm going to make that bend in the rail, and then I'm going to use my thumb and forefinger to work in the rest of the curve. The curve in the rail that I end up with doesn't have to be perfect, just good enough to take some of the spring out of the rail when attaching it to the copper PCB ties. Now I'm going to work on the closure rails, and I'll cut them roughly close to their finished length with a little left over. Then I'm going to use the point form tool to file a flat area on one end of the closure rail. The flat area will be the area that comes in contact with the stock rail when the turnout is thrown in that direction. Like the stockade tool, I'll slide the rail on one end of the point form. It's clearly marked with the word point on one side and frog on the other, so this rail is going into the side marked point. So with the point form all set, I'll once again take a position in front of the trash can and file away. And when I'm done, I have this nice shiny flat spot and we're ready to move on. And here are both closure rail ends filed flat. Now I'm going to form the wing rail on the frog end of the closure rail. And to do that, there's an engraved mark on the fixture near the frog that I'm going to use to make a mark on the closure rail with my Sharpie. While I'm doing this, the other end of the closure rail, which is the point, is lined up properly with the recess filed into the stock rail. Then with my rail nippers, I'm going to take a tiny wedge-shaped piece out of the base of the rail where I made my mark. And this is to allow a more precise bend to be made at this spot to form the wing. And now I'll just bend the rail here slightly to match the angle of the wing. With the closure rail held in place, I'll mark the excess rail that needs to be trimmed and snip it off. And repeating these steps, I'll form the other closure rail wing, and because this closure rail is curved, I've worked a bend into the rail to remove some tension, the same way I did with the curved stock rail. The final step in preparing the closure rails is to file a slight taper into the end, top inside of the frog wing. Man, that's a mouthful. But this slight taper will help your rolling stock enter the frog more smoothly. It's kind of hard to see here, but now the ends of the rails have that slight taper on the top side. Next, we're going to form the frog rails. So, remaining aware that I need rail past the end of the quick sticks tie bed for rail joiners, I cut the frog rails to roughly the same size each. Then, using the point form again, I'll take one end of the frog rail and put it in the side of the tool marked frog. And after filing both frog rails, we end up with perfectly angled ends to bring the frog to a nice point. The last bit of rail prep is forming the guardrails. For this step, there is an engraving that defines the exact length of the guardrail, so it's just a simple matter of sliding a piece of rail in the slot, marking it, and cutting it to length. Then, these smaller engravings on each side define the angles of the guardrail tips. These smaller engravings are machined at the proper angle, so you just slide the end of the guardrail in as far as it can go, then bend the rail that overhangs the fixture until it is perpendicular to the fixture, then voila! Perfectly angled guardrail. At this point, all the rail is prepped for the next step. So, I've got my stock rails, my closure rails, my frog rails, and my guards. The copper ties are in place and electrically gapped, so all of this says that I'm ready for the soldering detail. So once again, here's my trusty Weller soldering station, along with some solder, flux, and a cleaning pad. I'm going to begin the soldering steps with the straight stock rail. I'm putting the rail into the fixture and lining up the recess for the point rail. And since I don't have 3 hands, I'm using these rail tools to hold the rail in place. I'm going to start soldering at the copper tie closest to the center of the fixture, and here I'll just dab a little flux where the rail touches the tie, and then I'll just solder the rail to the tie. Now, when I get to ties like this one, where there's going to be another rail close by on one side, then I'll solder only the side that is opposite that other nearby rail. I'm going to skip over the throw bar tie because I don't want to solder any part of that to either of the stock rails. It might be better to just leave the throw bar tie out altogether until it's actually needed. Now I'm working my way from the center towards the frog end, and again I'm only soldering rail on one side when it's got another rail close by on the other side. In this case, it's the guard rails that are close to the stock rail for these 2 ties. And now I'm soldering the curved stock rail in place with the same considerations as a straight stock rail, such as point rail recess alignment, soldering on only one side when near other rails, starting from the center and working outwards, and so on. Now I'm putting one of the closure rails in place. This is the curved one, and based on the work I did earlier, everything should just fall into place. But I need to be sure to get the alignment of the point end right so that it lines up with the recess that I filed in the stock rail earlier. Another important note, I'm starting to solder the closure rail at the tie marked with the letter S, and then moving on in the direction of the frog. At this stage, there are no soldering points at the other end of the closure rail until later. And here I'm soldering again on only one side because I have the frog rails nearby. This is a straight closure rail going into place, and I'm basically repeating the same steps as the curved rail. Now I'm going to go ahead and slide in the frog rails at this point. It might be a good idea to have an NMRA track gauge to check your spacing here, but I've built so many of these turnouts that I can just look at it and see that it's aligned properly. The last rails to go in are the guardrails. I didn't show it here, but I also soldered the area where the frog rails came to a point between the wings. At this point, all the rails are firmly in place, and I can remove the assembly from the fixture and have a good look at it. Next, I'm going to solder the first of the points to the throw bar tie. It's important that no solder from this step gets between the point and the stock rail. If it does, then it could hinder the turnout's operation, or worse, solder the point to the stock rail. To ensure that this doesn't happen, I've placed this little slip of paper between the point rail and the stock rail, which prevents the solder from flowing where I don't want it to. The other point rail needs to be soldered in a way that allows the throw bar tie to move both points from one position to the other. To perform this soldering step, I'm using a copper tie to act as a spacer to move the other point rail into the correct position for soldering, and I've also put some weight on the point rail to ensure solid contact with the throw bar tie. And now with both points soldered, I'll just do a quick check to see how it all operates. Looks like it's working pretty well, so I'm on to the final step for this stage, which is doing a little blending of the point rails with the stock rail. And for that, I'm using this small file to file the side of the point rail and then slowly rotate topside to complete the blending. And I'll repeat on the other point rail. One final check of the turnouts operation, and I'm pretty happy with the results. So at this point, we're ready to move on to the next step, which is fastening this turnout assembly to the quick sticks tie bed. But before we do that, let's take another break and have a look at this HO scale DM&IR Yellowstone from MTH. I ordered this last year and it arrived while I was in the middle of making this video. So I figured let's take a quick look at it out of the box, and then I'll have some video at the end where I'll give it a test run on the layout. And once again, let's get back to the turnout build to complete the final assembly, and then we'll have a look at the MTH Yellowstone making a test run on the layout. In the last turnout segment, I had finished assembling the rail to the copper PCB ties, and now it's time to attach the rail assembly to the quick sticks wood tie bed. I need to remove one of two ties from the quick sticks that aligns with my choice of solid points. Now with the ply bond glue, I'm going to carefully run a bead of glue on the quick sticks where it comes in contact with the rails. And when looking at the quick sticks, it's fairly easy to see where that is. This handy tip that comes with the ply bond makes it easier to spread a thin, even line of glue. And I'm just going to work my way along the length of the quick sticks. Now, the ply bond is a contact cement, so I need to apply glue to the bottom side of the rails as well. I'm being very careful not to get glue on the points since they need to move. So I'm using this copper tie as a spacer to give me some working room. Now I'm giving the contact cement some time to set up, about 15 minutes. I want to make sure it's not wet for the next step. So here I'm lining up the rail assembly with the quick sticks and carefully lowering it in place. Contact cement wants to grab pretty hard at this time, so I need to be really careful with the alignment. Now I'm just going to take this scrap piece of pine and press it along the rails here to make sure I get a firm bond with the quick sticks. And now I'm going to take a hot soldering iron and heat up some of these glue joints near what I consider the high stress areas. That would be near both ends and near the copper ties. This heat essentially vulcanizes the contact cement for a very strong bond between the rail and the wood. Now with the rails firmly bonded to the quick sticks, you can gently break away the excess wood from the assembly. And here we have one mostly completed number 8 turnout. We still have a few things to do though. So I'm going to clip off the excess rail at each end of the turnout. Now I need to electrically isolate the frog. And to do that I need to completely cut through the rails here and here. To make these cuts, I'm going to use the coping saw. I'm going to place the turnout into this bench vise here and tighten it just enough to hold it firmly for the cutting task. Now I'll detach one end of the saw blade and thread the saw blade through the turnout where I need to make the cut. And then I'll carefully cut through both frog rails at this point. Then I'll shift the turnout in the vise to the side a bit to make the second set of cuts. And now with both cuts made, I'm taking my thin file here and I'm cleaning up the cuts from the back side, just to make sure there are no metal bits that could cause a short later on. And finally, the last step I'm going to perform in this video is to drill a hole in the throw bar tie so that my turnout machine can throw it. And the turnout machines that I'm using are these servo actuated machines from Tam Valley Depot, and I want to drill a hole in the throw bar between the two gaps that I filed earlier. So for this step, it's best to use a drill press to align the drill with the turnout and drill the hole exactly where you want it. After I drilled the hole, I filed the backside to remove any flashing from the drilling, and then I test fit the turnout machine. So there you have it, one number 8 turnout ready for wiring and installation on the layout. Which brings us to the end of this portion of the video. And now, we're going to give the MTH Yellowstone a shakedown run on the layout and get a closer look at how those turnouts perform. So that brings us to the end of this episode's model railroading adventure, and as per usual, we now enter the random subject portion of the video. And this time we're headed off to Italy, one of my favorite European destinations. This is a pre-pandemic trip, so please don't be alarmed at the lack of face masks and social distancing. If you're curious, stick around, otherwise we'll see you next time.
Bridge, constructed in 1588. Just like it has guys.
Enjoy the wonderful day. Oh, it's just beautiful. Yeah. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno to America.
Some silly bridge with buildings on it. They're about
The other day performed the part from my musical there. Symbolize the sky, red, yellow, some landscape. Behind you, you also see a single bedded room at near the. Beautiful place, autentico, pieces of
Things that they collected.